Hi everyone, we are moving on to our second lecture now of our conservation module. Today we are going to be talking more about biodiversity and what that means and why we even care about biodiversity. So our learning objectives today are to talk about the types of biodiversity that are of interest to conservation biologists. And we're also going to talk about this idea of an ecosystem service, different types and what those are. So thinking about our last lecture, some quick review, right? We talked about the IUCN and how they are the group that makes this red list of endangered species. And in order to do that, they look at both extrinsic and intrinsic factors. Extrinsic factors being ones that are outside the animal's biology that are ultimately going to have an effect on their vulnerability. So we're looking at habitat fragmentation, pollution, deforestation, poaching. And then we have intrinsic factors. And these are ones that have something to do with the animal's biology themselves that make them particularly vulnerable. So big animals, remember, are more vulnerable. Our long-lived animals are going to be more vulnerable, ones that reproduce slowly and not a whole lot of offspring at one time. Also being higher up in the trophic level is going to have a negative effect. And then if you are endemic to a specific area, you're going to be more likely to become a threatened species as well. All right, so what is conservation? This is a relatively new scientific discipline. So this is the one that is devoted to understanding and preserving biodiversity. And this can look like a lot of different things. So I have this just word map of terms related to conservation biology. You can be a biologist of all kinds of different corners and still have a hand in conservation biology. For example, I'm an animal physiologist, but I'm studying an invasive species, and that can have a pretty big effect on an ecosystem. So I am a little bit of a conservationist as well, which is great. It means we get input from all kinds of different disciplines. When we talk about conservation as a whole, we can end up looking at biodiversity at a number of different levels. So the smallest level that you can look at biodiversity at is at a genetic diversity level. So this is how robust are the genes of a certain population. So how much variation is there genetically in a population? And we talked about this a bit in our GMO module, how populations that are bounded by a small number of individuals have low genetic variation, and then you end up seeing some diseases kind of crop up because of that lack of variation. So the cheetahs are kind of a classic example of looking at genetic diversity, where we see an incredibly low number of cheetahs left in the wild. And what we do have left, they're also genetically rather similar. So this leaves a population incredibly vulnerable to disease and even environmental conditions changing. If you don't have traits out there that could potentially be robust against these things, you're going to end up with an extinct species. So slightly bigger level way of looking at that is within species diversity. So how many species do you have in an ecosystem as a whole? Healthy ecosystems are going to have a large number of species, and less healthy ecosystems are going to have a smaller number of species. Next level up from that is ecosystem diversity. So how many types of ecosystems do we have in the biosphere? a healthy biosphere has a lot of different types of ecosystems. You know, we have our rainforests, we have our deserts, we have mountains, we have marine environments, aquatic environments. We have all these different kinds of ecosystems, and they're each important to playing a role in a healthy biosphere as a whole. So we want lots of good, healthy ecosystems in order to have good ecosystem diversity. So as a non-bio major, why the heck should you care about our ecosystem diversity? Turns out that there are a lot of services that the ecosystems provide to us that most of us take for granted in our daily lives. So these are just things that like basically allow us to exist on the planet Earth. So it's broken down. Ecosystem services are broken down into these different categories. We have supporting services, provisioning services, regulating, and cultural services. And we're going to talk about what each of those categories means. So starting with provisioning services, these are goods that we are provided just being on planet Earth. So we have plants that grow and provide us food. They also provide food to the animals that people eat. We have woody resources to build things with. We actually have water to drink. This is unique when it comes to planets, right? This is one of the first things that people look for when they're looking for life on another planet is their water. And most of us take that for granted on a daily basis that we have water. So that's a provisioning service, an example of a natural resource that is provided to us by healthy ecosystems. And we have regulating services. So these are the ones that help the world to go around and for things to sort of function in the way that we expect them to on a daily basis. So these are going to alter the quality of products from our ecosystem. So for example, clean water. Is our water running? Is it getting nice and aerated? Is it polluted? And on the right there is a picture of mangrove trees down in Florida. So mangroves are really important because they grow like right there on the edge between land and water. And they provide a regulating service in controlling for erosion. So where the water would naturally eat away at the land there, those mangroves actually act as a barrier in protecting from that erosion. This is really important for people who like want to build houses near a beach. You don't want that land right near your house to eventually erode away. These trees are providing a really nice protective area. Down at the Outer Banks, if you all are familiar, they have sand dunes. These provide a similar type of a service. They've gotten pretty wiped out over the years between hurricanes, and you actually have started to be able to see some pretty severe damage that's been done by losing that barrier between the ocean and the building. Insects are a regulating service that we end up taking for granted. So our bees are a really common example of this right now. We had talked about how bees are being affected by colony collapse disorder, and that seems to be attached to pesticide use. So what's ultimately happened is we've dramatically reduced the number of bees that we have. And bees act as pollinators. So in order for plants to actually produce a fruit or a vegetable, there has to be a pollination event. So the fruit and the vegetable that you are eating, it's actually like a fertilized ovary of the plant. But that can only happen if there's a pollinator who has gone from one plant to another plant and fertilized that plant in order to get the actual food. So when we lose the honeybees, we've now lost a regulating service that used to be free. And what has ended up happening is farmers now have to actually hire someone to bring in bees that they release on their farm and get that pollination going on. And then the bees will come back to their hive and they'll be taken to the next farm. But that's a service that that used to just be provided by a healthy population of pollinators. And now we've caused this disruption where you now are going to have to pay for something that used to be free. Insect control is another side of this as well. Amphibians are insect eaters, and amphibians are also one of the groups of animals that are being most affected by climate change. There's a fungus, it's called chytrid fungus, that has been widely affecting our amphibians, like causing just mass extinctions. And it's just this fungus that gets in the skin of the animals and then kind of like branches out and ultimately kills them. But these were animals that were eating our insects. They eat mosquitoes. So we're going to start to see the rise of more infectious disease when we lose our animals that were eating insects. So, for example, Zika and other mosquito-borne illnesses that you've been hearing about in the news. Those are things that our amphibians were going to help to control for. Since we've wiped that population out, now we end up having a problem that we didn't have before when we had a healthy ecosystem. And we've already talked quite a bit about deforestation, how our forests are an incredibly important part of a healthy biosphere for us. So their carbon sinks, which means they're going to absorb that excess carbon dioxide that we are pumping into the air, but then we cut down all the trees and we lose that sink. That becomes a huge problem in terms of regulating our atmospheric composition, leading to things like climate change. Then we have cultural services that we get from our healthy ecosystems. These are things like ecotourism or like our national parks. I imagine most of you have been to at least one national park. We enjoy the outdoors. We enjoy looking at healthy, happy animals. And when we lose that, we lose a part of what makes our world amazing. And there's a whole new little kind of like category of tourism called ecotourism, where they're sort of trying to capitalize on this idea that we love nature and we want to be exposed to it and we want to see the things. So this can be really, really cool when it's groups that are dedicated to protecting certain species. So whale shark tourism is a huge thing. So that's a whale shark that's on your right. That is the biggest fish that is alive now. They're not dangerous to humans. They're filter feeders. So they just have these giant mouths that suck in food. But being able to snorkel around whale sharks is a huge ecotourism thing. Which is better than trying to catch them and kill them for shark fin soup, for sure. Same with safaris in Africa. A lot of people pay a lot of money to go and see elephants being elephants, and the goal is that replaces the income of people who might be tempted to kill elephants to make money off of those tusks instead. So then we have our supporting services. These are all of the other things that go on within our ecosystems to just support everything. So for example, here we have our plants that we're going to eat. And in order for that to take place, we rely on a lot of other things to go on here. So our plants are going to need nitrogen in the soil. We have certain bacteria that are really good at breaking that down. We have our decomposers in the form of both bacteria and fungus. Then we have other special bacteria for fixing the nitrogen. There's a lot that goes on, and this is just a very small example of a supporting service. Supporting services are all of the things that are just happening around us to keep the world turning. So if you are not a biologist, not even a nature lover, kind of don't really care. But like you're a human with money who invests in our economy, then these are still things that you should care about, because when we have weak biodiversity, we pay literally in money for that. And there has been a lot of effort kind of put into putting a monetary value on these services, because it's often really hard to wrap your mind around how important something is without a dollar sign on it. And it's kind of awful, but it's true. So of the ecosystem services that we just talked about, economists have ranged that those services themselves have a value of around 125 to 145 trillion dollars. So imagine needing to find that kind of money in each country's budget in order to just support the people that live there. That's free stuff for us just by taking care of our ecosystems. That seems way, way, way worth the cost, be it in convenience of having to, drive less or change your diet, buy differently, live just a little bit more sustainably in order to actually keep these ecosystem services that are valued at such a high dollar functioning really well. So it's something to consider if you're just having a hard time caring about climate change. Think about the money. This is going to be money out of your pocket one day to help fix these problems, just so that you can eat and not get diseases and not have your house washed away when we have the next big storm, which we absolutely will have another big storm. So when it comes to the services themselves, the ecosystem services and biodiversity, what we find is that a positive correlation is found between high biodiversity and ecosystem services. So an ecosystem that has a ton of genetic variability, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity is going to be a much stronger service provider. So it's going to be less fragile. It's going to have more species that are going to be able to actually assist with each of the tasks. And it's going to be more productive overall. So it is worth it on our end to support and protect biodiversity, just so we can keep these ecosystems running smoothly and supporting us. So to follow that up, there's this idea of a redundancy hypothesis, and that's that in a really healthy ecosystem, you're going to have several species that have relatively similar jobs. And this is not redundant in a bad way, it's redundant in a really good way, because if there's an issue with one of these species, that means the entire ecosystem and that service doesn't crumble with that species. So just looking at this figure, it's looking at different types of pollinators here. So again, these are all animals that are going to be really helpful at bringing pollen from one plant to another plant, which is going to allow for fertilization and ultimately creating the fruits and vegetables that you all eat. So we have bats, we have birds, butterflies, and bees and beetles. So in a healthy ecosystem, there's room for one of these species to have a bad year, but to rebound. If you're in a poorly diverse ecosystem and you only have one pollinator left, that's a problem. You're going to run into issues real fast when that species starts to decline. We also have the rivet hypothesis, and that is this idea that an ecosystem is like a plane's wing, and each of the species are like a rivet in that wing. Whereas losing a few rivets is not a huge deal unless they are in a really important place for that wing. Then it becomes a big deal really fast. So in terms of species diversity, the big rivets end up being what we call a keystone species. So these are species that end up playing a really huge role in controlling the balance of everything else within that ecosystem. So I have an example for you here of sharks and rays and the health of a marine system. So the shark is a keystone species. It's going to be exercising top-down control over everything else that's happening within this example. So sharks actually eat rays, and rays are going to eat a variety of invertebrates, particularly things like oysters. This is a very real example in the Chesapeake Bay area, which is close to where I was before I moved here. So what happens is once the sharks have become overfished or there's no longer suitable habitat for them, the ray population ends up getting out of control. And when that population has a big increase, they totally decimate the invertebrates around them. So in the Chesapeake Bay, it was oysters that were getting hit really hard. And this is a problem because people's livelihoods depended on those oysters. So oysters were a big deal in restaurants around there. And the cow-nosed rays just wiped out that population without the sharks there in order to assist in that cow-nose ray population control. So people ultimately ended up getting financially harmed by the fact that the sharks were no longer around to control here. So this is just an example. There's all kinds of keystone species out there. As soon as we start to see knocks to their population, we see an entire ecosystem start to get out of whack really fast. So this is another consideration that like the IUCN is going to use when they are determining the importance of conserving certain species. All right, so that lands us at the end of this lecture. We are going to next go a bit more into detail about species diversity. So we already talked about how a species is defined and how you get a species. Now we're going to talk about like the major classes of animals and how we see branching off happening. So 2 more lectures left. We've got invertebrate diversity and we've got vertebrate diversity. Until then, I hope you all are staying well. See you soon.